Hello, welcome to Chapter 9, Patterns of Inheritance. In this chapter, we'll examine the rules that govern how inherited traits are passed from parents to offspring. While we are studying these rules, we'll realize how the behavior of chromosomes during gamete formation and fertilization, as we studied in Chapter 8, accounts for the patterns of inheritance we observe. Much of this work in understanding the rules behind genetics was uncovered by the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel. And therefore, I will explain to you the concepts that are in Chapter 9 using the slideshow called Mendel's Dreams. It has the same content as the slideshow that's titled Chapter 9, but this is a more interesting way of exploring these concepts. So let's get started. We're going to talk about some of the history of Gregor Mendel's work on patterns of inheritance. We're going to talk about the current belief at that time when Gregor Mendel discovered his patterns of inheritance, and that current belief was known as the blending hypothesis. Then we'll talk about two laws that Gregor Mendel developed called the law of segregation of alleles and the law of independent assortment. And then we'll do some mathematical calculations to determine the genotype of offspring. And this mathematical working is carried out using a Punnett square. Then we'll draw some conclusions about inheritance from genetic cross data. We'll predict outcomes from genetic cross experiments, and then we'll design our own genetic cross experiments. Here is a picture of monks in the abbey. Gregor Mendel is standing second from right, holding a fuchsia in his hand. A fuchsia is a varied colored flower that is well suited for genetic experiments. The experiments we are going to talk about in this chapter, however, are those based on the pea plant. So, picture yourself in the late 1800s, because we're going to go back into Gregor's time and start thinking like he was, knowing as much as he did at that time. All right, so this is the late 1800s. We're talking about Gregor Mendel here. He was dying, and it was January. As was fitting for an old man with a swollen feet, a disagreeable kidney, and an untenable position on the chessboard, he closed his eyes. He dozed in an old man's way, thinking not of yesterday's battle with the city alderman over the infernal tax problems of the abbey, but of his childhood days on the farm, his sister who had forfeited her dowry so he could go to school, and his parents. He pulled his cleric's robe tighter around his ample frame. He was cold. He waited. For Leo, the choir master, had promised he would play at his funeral. He smiled and remembered him as a boy. For 16 years he had been the abbot of the abbey, a great honor, but it had drained his strength. He could no longer tend to his scientific studies. Still, there were compensations. Yet at this moment, on this cold January 6th, he had difficulty remembering what they were. But mostly he remembered his beloved garden in the abbey, where he worked so long ago, 8 years, with 29,000 pea plants to tend. Wow! How long ago was it? 20, 30 years? Here, boys, listen. He was once again a teacher at Slime. Listen, boys, it is possible to crossbreed plants just like animals. One has to take the pollen from one plant with a small brush and carefully, so carefully, place it on another. Here, I take the pollen from the male anther and place it upon the carpel, contains the ovary, of another plant. Then the plant does the rest. So you understand what's going on here. The process of transferring pollen from the anther to the carpel is called pollination. The process that occurs after pollination, where the pollen fuses with the ova, is called fertilization. Fertilization is what results in an embryo. But why would you do that, Father? Because I want to know the rules. There must be rules. laws of breeding, just as there are laws of physics. I want to find those rules. That is why, Master Pavel, I seek the answers. But how do you stop a bee bringing pollen from one plant to another to mix up your results, Father? Try to guess. What should I do? Possibly bring the plant inside, or cut the anther off before you pollinate the plant, or cover the plant with a little sack, or maybe, Father, you just pray? Yes, I did most of those things. Sometimes I did work in the greenhouse when I worked in my garden. I covered the flower with a little cheesecloth bag, and I did have to remove the anther of the flower so that it would not fertilize itself. And most assuredly I did pray. I was particularly interested in testing the old idea that the traits of the offspring were a simple blending of the characteristics of the two parents. You boys all know that you look like a combination of your two parents. Pavel, you have your mother's nose and sense of humor, and your father's eyes and his musical talent. The same with all of us. But I had long wondered what would happen if I looked carefully at individual traits. What then? This brings us to the concept that he just mentioned, the blending hypothesis. This hypothesis is the now discredited theory that inheritance of traits from two parents produces offspring with characteristics that are intermediate between those of the parents. The blending hypothesis states that genes mix in such a way that the resultant trait is a combination or blending of the parent traits in much the same way that mixing red and white paint would result in the color pink. If you look at all the traits of an organism, it may appear that the organism is a blend of the two parents, but when you look at individual traits, you see that that is not the case. If blending hypothesis was true, then you would be able to get back the red and white paint from the mixed pink paint. You know you can't do that. That is, traits do not mix in the offspring. So, let's check your understanding. Here is one of my experiments. What do you think would happen when I breed a white flowered plant with a purple flowered plant, if the blending hypothesis is correct? So pause here and write down your answer. Right, the next slide has the answer. If you understood what the blending hypothesis talked about, then you correctly wrote down C. All of the flowers in the next generation would be light purple, an intermediate of the white and the purple flowers, as your correct choice. Now, this is what was believed at that time. But Gregor Mendel went on to prove that there is no blending, there is no mixing of all traits in the next generation. And let's see how he came to that conclusion. Here is what did happen. It is not at all what the plant scholars anticipated. So here you see a white flower being crossed with a purple flower by the process that we saw in slide 9. And the offspring, all purple flowers. How can that be, Father? Where did the white go? Purple must be stronger than white. I say it dominates the white. I think so too, Pavel. I think so too, but not in the way you imagine. Let me show you another cross, this time between a tall plant and a short plant. Notice I am only watching one trait at a time. I could be watching the flower color too, but that would be too complicated. Let's just look at the height of the plant. So, when you are doing an experiment where you are only following one trait, for example, in this case, height of the plant, and not color of the flower and shape of the flower, etc., just height of the plant, then such an experiment is called a monohybrid cross. Mono obviously stands for one. Hybrid is the process of creating a hybrid, bringing in two varieties, fertilizing them to get a new hybrid, a new offspring. Okay, so in this experiment, Gregor Mendel bred two tall plants together. That's what you see happening here, two tall plants together. When these tall plants by convention are referred to as the parental generation, or P for short. On the other side of the abbey, he bred two short plants together. Again, because this is the parental strain that we're talking about, it's also referred to as the P generation. When he did this pollination and fertilization experiment, he found that where he bred the two tall flowers or two tall plants together, the offspring were all tall. And where he bred two short plants together, the offspring were all short. The first generation of offspring is referred to by this symbol F1 for filial one, first generation of offspring. So back to Gregor Mendel. Here he bred two tall parents with each other, and they breed true. They produce all tall children. So here's another term to remember, breed true. A true breed is that variety of plant that bears the same traits as the parent. So in the F1 generation, you see that they all have the same characteristics as the parental plants, which means the F1 generation is a true breed. And I breed two short plants and they breed true, yielding all short. But look what happens when I breed a tall and short together. So we saw the P in the F1 generation in the previous slide. Now, if you were to cross these all tall from the F1 generation with these all short from the F1 generation on the other side, the offspring were all tall. Where did the short go? So the next generation that appears in your experiment is referred to as the F2 generation, again for filial 2, the second generation. It is the same thing, Father. The short has disappeared. Where has it gone? Tall is stronger than short. So what we know now is that the tall trait is referred to as the dominant trait. A dominant trait is a trait that always appears in the next generation, irrespective of what other trait is also inherited alongside it. Okay. The same thing happened with these traits too. The ones on top are dominant over those below. What could I conclude? That means when he bred a gray and round seed with a white and wrinkled seed, he saw that the offspring were always gray and round. The F3 generation was always gray and round. Similarly, when he bred the yellow cotyledons with the green cotyledons, the offspring were always yellow cotyledons. Okay, that's what we mean by a dominant trait. Okay, so think about this question, and then when we resume in our next video, we'll look at the answers.